And welcome back to the B2Z Podcast. I'm here with my Uncle Bob Humphreys, and this is episode number 2. And we are here today, January 18th, talking about what lies ahead, and of course the inauguration coming up on Wednesday as Joe Biden will be sworn in as president. So we're here today to talk about the future and what the first few days look like, or at least the first 10 days as they write about quite a bit in the press, and even a little bit beyond that, what we see, if we could see into the future, what type of things would we be looking at? So, Uncle Bob, we'll just kind of start with what's coming up on Wednesday, and what are you most interested in watching, I guess, in these first several weeks of Biden's presidency?
Usually I don't think people tune in, and historically have tuned in as much. It's usually something you see on the evening news and you catch a clip of. Most people don't watch it from home. I think we've got two influences. I think we've got COVID-19, meaning that a lot of people are working from home, and that may be playing in the background. I think we have the most National Guardmen deployed than we've ever had before for an inauguration. You begin to think that they may be anticipating some unrest. And so you begin to wonder what it's all going to look like. Now, understanding that President-elect Biden has wanted to restore some civility to the presidency, my guess would be it's going to be done in a very traditional kind of way. It's going to follow probably a very scripted kind of process. I can't imagine it's going to deviate too much from that. And again, I don't know, I don't know that the networks always covered this to the extent that we're probably going to get much more coverage, particularly from the mainstream media, than we have had historically. But again, I'm not sure who's going to be able to get close and who's not going to be able to get close, because the way that the security is going to have to be. So.
Yeah, I think you bring up an interesting point in that it does kind of feel like more and more people will be watching this than normally than normal. Of course, we had the biggest voter turnout, which we talked about. So maybe that's a part of it. People are more interested and engaged in politics, which is a good thing. But I did do like a quick look, and I saw a Washington Post article today. So some of the things that Biden will be focused in on in his first 10 days, COVID-19, so more testing, more vaccinations. Immigration policy was a big one, rapid changes, so he says, are coming to that. Racial equality. And then one that I thought was interesting because it was one we had talked about, but he seems that he's going to have some kind of effort to, I don't want to say combat, but I guess he'll speak with big tech and see what type of things they can do with antitrust laws and things of that such, which I know we hinted at. The article I did read from the Washington Post says there is pretty much bipartisan support, which I think is interesting because that's hard to find. What are your thoughts on that?
That they're going to have bipartisan support for big tech, or
for cracking down, I guess, a little bit on big tech.
I think that for many people, they saw it as a First Amendment right, and what I'm going to say is that I don't think it was ever really a First Amendment right. They have always, as their industry has been, they've always regulated who gets to be able to post and who doesn't. They're driven by much the same things that the television media has been driven by. they're driven by ratings, and they want to be able to have good ratings, because good ratings translates into better advertising dollars. And I think that there's the same thing is happening with the social media. Okay, I'm not going to invest my dollars with you unless I know that I'm going to get a return on my investment. And we've seen that happen in a couple of places. If we look at the shift simply in radio has now tried to sell themselves on the demographic that they reach, and who they reach, and how they reach them, and how it adds value for people to be advertising on the radio. And I think at a time when radio ads are very difficult to sell, oftentimes you get concerned about, you want to have that. But many of the local advertisers have been hit by COVID-19 and affected in terms of adverse effects. And so we're seeing a lot of radio stations not able to sell the kind of ads that they did, and it's been a tough. I think that industry has probably been affected. And we watch what's happened with newspaper ads are very difficult to sell, and they've streamlined and cut way back. But now they have the added value of being online and an online presence, and so we're reaching more people because we're online. And here's what your value is. So again, I think that some of this has been regulated by the advertising revenue. That's how they set their policies. I think that they also have their own standards that they set for fear that the government would be setting standards for them. Mm-hmm. They didn't want that. They didn't want that to happen. They've done some things that try to avoid falling under the FCC's regulatory mandates that have more or less worked up until this point. I think there may be some backlash now with all that's happened in terms of some of the rhetoric that get hurled out there.
Right. So. I think you bring up a lot of really good points. One is this, it opens up the box to free speech. And I think there's so many things going on at once with this, but the fact that they are private companies, they can set their own rules and regulations. And hence why you see somebody like Donald Trump get kicked off Twitter, right? Because they have the power to do that. And I guess the scary thing is, people who would push back on that and say, well, they shouldn't have that much power, right? Well, what would be the other answer? The government would have power.
Right.
Right. And would that work? I want to say there was a president, I forget the president, but under the Alien and Sedition Acts, you couldn't say anything negative about the president. And the person who governed that was the president, which hence why they're not there anymore, right? Because
right.
The governor, or then the president rather, can then just pick and choose what, they like and what they don't like about, what people are saying about him or her. So what do you think about all that? I know that's just it.
I think it's interesting because the very people that would say the industry should not be regulated or self-regulated because we don't want the government involved, we don't trust the government, are also the people who are protesting right now the fact that that certain people have been banned from the internet. And I think that it's an interesting quandary because you can't have things both ways. You can't say, I don't want the government involved. And then you can't also say at the same time, I don't think the industry should regulate itself.
Right.
Okay. It's really who's going to be the Overwatch person on social media, if not the government. And if really what you don't trust is the government, although, in some respects, you got to say, who is more untrustworthy, the government or the social media? Because we know the social media don't get things right either. You were talking at the top about trying to address issues. The President-elect Biden was planning to address issues in terms of the African American community or civil rights and that kind of stuff. Mm-hmm. But if you believe what the social media had to say, and I have to go back because I don't have another source. But if I look at the social media depicted our current president, Donald Trump, as having been really instrumental in growing jobs, and saw the biggest growth in jobs for the African American community. And so if that's to be believed, if that's supposed to be an accurate statistic, and it's not one that he was going around touting, but this was coming, whatever the source was touted as being one of his legacies. And I'm thinking to myself, well, we know that he's tainted the legacy at this point, but if that's an accurate thing, how much does President-elect Biden really have to do? Because again, I think, and again, I sometimes I get the impression that they promise all kinds of things and then don't deliver. Donald Trump promised that he was going to basically do away with Obamacare for a variety of reasons, and none of that happened. And so, I guess you'll watch carefully in that first 100 days, and you watch to see what kinds of things that they put into place, and you watch to see how closely the promises that were made match up with what's actually taking place. Because I think sometimes there's this thing that happens with the presidency. I think sometimes we see the president as having far more power than presidents have. So the president is responsible for the economy. No, the last time I checked, the economy is driven by lots of things, some of which the president has nothing to do with. And so I don't know how he always gets straddled. I don't know how presidents in the past have always been saddled with the economy as being within their purview and their power. Yeah, we have the Federal Reserve, and the Federal Reserve does policies that affect all different kinds of things, including the stock market. We know the stock market is very sensitive to changes in political power, and it's very sensitive to which party is in power in the Senate, which party is in power in the House of Representatives. And those kinds of variables are there. But there's a volatility to the stock market, kind of reactionary, that the president really has no control over.
Right.
But we always put that at the president's feet.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think we often forget how many checks and balances there really are in our system. And I think that's, I'm not a proponent to say our system is perfect and we've got everything figured out, but comparatively, I think we're still in a pretty good place because of those checks and balances, because of, term limits when it comes to the presidency, things like that. But going back to your point with the stock market, I think you raise a really good point in saying that, if you are looking at investments right now and looking at the news, you would think, okay, Biden's coming in, electric vehicles, EV, solar energy, these type of things are going to be issues that he will push forward. Climate change and any technology that combats that. I know I've heard of one that's a company that's looking at ocean, some kind of ocean powered source, which makes sense because, it's such a big part of our mass, our world. But how many of those things, like you said, really come back on the president, and how much benefit is there in just looking at the president to see those changes? I think that's a good question.
I think the other thing is that, and it doesn't matter where you fall in terms of the political spectrum, but an issue like electric cars and things that are going to be more environmentally safe, I think that's all well and good. And is it something that we're going to be able to equip the infrastructure to build within 4 years of a president's term? And it's an ambitious plan at best. He has to garner the cooperation of big business in order to make that happen. I also think that the way that things are going at this point, that industry has been very, very slow. A couple of things happen. What we find is that people are not willing to invest in new vehicles. Generally, they tend to keep their vehicles longer. They, somewhat on purpose, I think, we've watched any of the electric vehicles that have come to market. They lose their value faster than the gasoline-driven cars with the fossil fuels. They lose their value faster. And they're overpriced, which is why part of the reason that they lose their value faster, because they weren't worth that much to begin with. And there'd have to be very huge incentives, and you'd have to be able to manufacture them at such a high level. The mass production would have to be there to be able to make that happen. And I don't know that they're ready to really do that, and that industry is ready to convert that way. Yes, it's moving, but I think it's moving slower than the ambitiousness of the plan that was outlined may be. And that's not to say that the plan doesn't have merit and that there aren't people that would look at the plan and support the plan. I just don't know that it's going to be, you're not going to be able to change it that fast. And I'm not sure you could change it within 8 years, but that's
Right.
a different issue, I think.
I agree with you. I don't think it's going to change overnight, or in this case, in 4 years. But I do think Biden will set the motion forward and help that growth. So maybe instead of it being 2035, it's 2030. I know California has super ambitious goals of 2025. I don't see that happening. But they would be the state that would push that forward more so than other parts of the country. And if you look outside of the U.S. a little bit too, you really start to see that this is a global trend. For instance, if you look at Norway, now granted, Norway has a fraction of the people that we do in the United States. I want to say 6 million, 7 million, don't quote me on that. But electric vehicles are huge there, and they will be fully integrated, and almost everyone will have one very, very soon within the next, they're projecting 5 years. I have a student from Norway, and Boss Day, if you watch this, he's taught me a lot about it. And then there's Tesla charging stations everywhere. And he really, started telling me about this. I'm like, wow, now again, a lot easier to implement that when there's far less people. Norway is also a very wealthy country too. They have a lot of oil. But I do think these type of industries like solar powered energy, EV, outside of maybe the presidential change, I think what this pandemic has shown is that healthcare, in looking at various ways to combat diseases or things like we're going through right now, because the world continues to get more and more populated. This isn't the end all be all virus. There's going to be more of these, right? And I know some people don't like to think of it that way, or maybe they're fearful of that, but that's the nature of the beast, right? And if anything, I think this has set the healthcare system forward to combat these type of things from happening again, and really happening in a situation where it's far worse than the situation we're dealing with now. Not to downplay the situation, but early on they said we might lose 10% of our population. That was super scary. And to say that can't happen in the future, I think you'd be lying. And I think this opens a lot of people's eyes in the healthcare system too.
I think one of the things that surprises me about all of this is that we tend to be very knee-jerk. And some knee-jerk reactions are slower than others. Certainly there's a knee-jerk reaction to climate change that takes place. But it's been very slow knee-jerk. I think there's going to be a knee-jerk reaction to COVID. I think there has been. But a 100-year pandemic is still a 100-year pandemic. And most of the people in healthcare are not going to be there to see it in 100 years, to be able to say it's a priority again. There may be other issues that take precedent along the way. I think I've got to come at it more from the people that are working the front lines in healthcare right now. A colleague of mine was working with someone who shared that, I usually lose 6 patients a year, because working in healthcare, there are going to be times when you encounter people who die. And she said, I lost 6 people in the last 2 days. So when I look at the emotional toll that it's taking, and again, obviously I have a bit of a bias as a mental health provider, that I don't know that we realize the toll that it's taking on the healthcare industry in terms of the personnel. It's very, very challenging, I think, to be somebody on the front lines of that, somebody that's having to deal with this on a day-to-day basis. And I think the emotional toll is extreme right now. And we may see changes like exodus from the professions. We may see people moving away from healthcare industry after the events of this take place. We're going to certainly see a rise in trauma-related kinds of reactive kinds of things. And I'll be curious to see, because again, every president has their own agenda. President Obama was very, very kind to the mental health profession, did a lot of good things for the mental health profession. And I get concerned that I have not heard any mention of that in terms of the Biden administration. And yet, we talk about the human toll in terms of the deaths. I think we have to look at the human toll in terms of the living that are surviving this thing, that we're working the front lines. These folks are the equivalent of our soldiers right now. And, sometimes we've not treated our vets very well after they've come back. And so I worry about where are we going to be? And so again, I'll be looking at that first 100 days and saying, okay, what's going to happen in that area? Now, again, that's my little niche, and I understand that that's my niche, but I don't know that I'm overgeneralizing that worldwide we have healthcare workers who are suffering lots of emotional trauma at the hands of this virus, and nobody is really looking at that as being a COVID-related problem,
right?
Per se.
That's such a great point. No, it's such a great point, and really, you you're right. I mean, the only numbers that we see are death tolls. I mean, really, that's kind of what's at the forefront, and that's kind of, the agenda, right? But you're so right. I mean, if you look at, and you would probably know this too. I mean, I know you do. I mean, suicides are up. Addictions are up. Marital problems and domestic violence rates are up. So, from your profession, and I know you can't talk about specifics and individuals, but could you speak more on that? I know you focused in on the healthcare side, but have you seen even just everyday people that maybe have somebody working in the healthcare system, or somebody closely related and them struggling mentally?
I haven't seen so much of that kind of concern. I know that the drinking stuff has gone up.
Mm-hmm.
I have people who never seemed to have any problem with their drinking are now presenting because, they were working from home and that they had a few. And now all of a sudden their employer is wondering why they're slurring their words during a Zoom meeting. Right. And you go, gee, oh boy, but again, in many states and in many places across the United States, the bars are closed. And so where are people drinking? At home. Okay. And if your spouse is working in that room way over there and you're working in this room over here, that drinking is probably could be taking place alone.
Right. Which is always scary.
Or, and again, there has been some of that isolating kinds of things that have happened that have contributed to that problem. I also think I do see more marital tension in terms of, we care about each other and we don't mind being together, but this has been way too much togetherness since March.
Right.
And how are you dealing with that in your home? Because it's very different. It's a very different animal than, and you can't get away from each other.
Right.
And depending on where you're living, my son had a buddy that was living in Chicago and spent 23 hours a day in the same, small apartment that they were probably paying 2/3 of what our mortgage payments would be here for a bigger house.
Of course.
And of course, just couldn't get away from the place. There was no place to go. There was nothing to do. Everything was shut down. And I can't imagine, sometimes in the larger cities, I think the stress of being alone and being isolated in a small apartment has got to be far worse. I mean, at least in the more, I guess, the suburbs, as it were, some of the larger cities or smaller cities where you have larger homes that are available to stay in, you're not all on top of each other and you're able to do that. And we don't have that sense of crowding
Mm-hmm.
that you have, in a major city where you've got people living in high-rise apartments and that's all they have is that one room efficiency, and they're there 23 hours a day, except when they go out to get something from the grocery store. Right.
And when the city's on and the hustle and bustle, it's great because you don't need a lot of space because you're always on the go. I mean, you're doing things, you're living the city life. But then when you can't, you're living, these four walls and in a small space, like you said. So
it's just shocking when you start looking at the effects of the isolation and what it has. And I think we need people. We need each other, and particularly when we get stressed. There's a stress hormone that gets released, oxytocin. Oxytocin promotes affiliation. Well, what's the one thing we're not supposed to be doing right now? Affiliating.
Right.
So now we're working against the stress hormones in a very stressful time. And of course, we're going to see things like perhaps more arguments with our spouse, and of course we may see an increase in drinking, and of course we're going to have the COVID-15. Although I keep hearing them say they keep calling it COVID-19, but I think it's more like 15 pounds. But
I haven't heard that yet. That's great.
You know, my gym is closed and all I can do is eat. You know, I mean,
that's great.
Too funny.
Yeah, I think you're right. It's challenging because, you know, as humans, I think we strive to be together. I mean, we you know, even things that are so simple, right? Like going out to eat. You know, going to the mall and just walking around, like not thinking like let's just go walk around, right? But like going out to eat's the one that really gets me. And I think if anything, it showed me how important eating together is, like, and how much we enjoy going out to a restaurant, and like that's so crucial to like humans and how we like to spend our time. And you can't do that in a lot of places. Now, some places you can. I mean, you know, it depends where you're at, but it's really challenging. I think so many people, instead of using this time to find themselves in a positive way, or maybe find a new hobby, or find something that they've always been interested in, now they have the time to pursue it, they've really kind of drowned maybe in their own thoughts. And because there's so much time and time spent indoors and inside, I think, you know, just being outside is such a great thing too.
And you think about the variety of things, you know, you've probably seen the memes, and again, we've been having some negative comments about alcohol, but there was a meme that I saw that said, put a glass of wine in every room in the house and go on a wine tour. I mean, because that's what you have to do. But having said that, I think that in some ways, because we are used to different venues and we go into different places, okay, when the weather was nice, we could eat on the deck, we could eat on the patio, we could eat in the kitchen, we could eat in the formal dining room, we could eat in our family room. So we had like 5 locations, and depending on wherever we might have either cooked something or picked something up from, you know, had brought to the house, all of a sudden you had a different venue that you could go to in some ways. And it was kind of cool. But you eliminate the outdoor part of the venues, and now you're narrowed to 3, you know, Definitely. And you go, oh, we're eating another meal in the family room. Oh, you know.
Right.
What is that?
And I know my dad, I mean, he would have never done this, I don't think, if we weren't in the pandemic, but he closed in his outdoor part.
Yep.
That was kind of his project to do so they could still enjoy that in the winter. I mean, it's just finding ways to, you know, I guess be creative to kind of keep your mind going and trudging on. So.
Well, I saw the pictures and I was very, very envious of that. I'm thinking to myself, and of course my son
came out pretty good.
He did, and my son saw it and he was like, Dad, we should do that to yours. And I'm like, yeah, but you know, it's kind of late in the game for that. It's too cold to be out there putting hammers and nails together. But
although winter's been pretty mild though, right? I mean, for the most part in Ohio.
They have said that I just heard today is the halfway point of winter.
Mm-hmm.
Our airport locally here in Akron-Canton, which you may know because I think you flew out of.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, Akron-Canton Airport has reported a record snowfall for the year, which I find to be hard to believe, that we had so much snow that they're saying it was a record for the first half of winter.
Wow.
Which I didn't think we had that much snow. But the other remarkable thing was that we usually have more temperatures in the teens at night, and we haven't had that. So It's been a fairly mild winter in that respect as well. And we'll have to see what the second half of winter has, because we're now at the halfway point. So,
well, to use weather as a jumping off point. So as we fast forward to the spring in March and April, What are you looking to see then from Biden and the administration? Where do you think we'll be at in COVID? I know nobody has a crystal ball. I don't like when people think that they do on this because I don't think anybody else knows. But where do you think, I mean, with the push for more vaccines, more testing, warmer weather, which also plays a factor, at least from what I've read, where do you think we'll be?
It's very difficult to say. For a couple of reasons. I know that there has been a lot of finger pointing back to the president's office about the distribution of these vaccines. I'm not sure that you can saddle all of that responsibility there. If you look at when the pandemic hit, there was a lot of power that was divested back to the governors, state governors, because what was happening? It was it needed to be regulated at the state level. Mm-hmm. Do the states have the infrastructure necessary to distribute this vaccine the way that they should? Probably not. Did they have the funding? Probably not. Did they get the kind of training that they needed to get to distribute this vaccine? Probably not. But who would have all of the foresight to be able to predict a 100-year pandemic? And I'm not trying to excuse it. Mm-hmm. I just look at it for what it is. Clearly, people like Dr. Fauci had their own ideas about how this distribution process should go. Mm-hmm. And I think at the state levels, you're going to get a various kinds of ways of implementing that strategy. Mm-hmm. Just real simple, just a very simple thing. Your grandparents are of an age where some of the things that are technologically out there that are available, like registering with your local health department, they don't necessarily have the savvy to be able to even do that. Mm-hmm. I talked to your uncle and said, hey, listen, here in our county, we're registering with the local health department and we're on a list, and then we can set up our appointments from there. And he put your grandparents on the list. Mm-hmm. Didn't even know that they had that available, even though he's already been vaccinated.
Right.
So I look at those kinds of things and I think to myself, we don't even know how to avail ourselves of the information, and it's not being distributed very well. Mm-hmm. Okay, so for example, our local television stations are out of Cleveland. How much information is Cleveland going to give us about our county and how we're distributing? We're not going to get it there. Mm-hmm. The newspapers have been gutted, and so there's not even anybody that's covering it that well there. Local radio has some level of coverage, but we also know that a lot of people aren't listening to the radio right now. And, so we don't know that that's the best way to distribute the information. Mm-hmm. And the local health departments, they don't have the funding to put it up on social media. And social media isn't offering it for free.
Right.
So where's the big information push coming from, and how do we get this information out?
That's a great point. Yeah, I think that's something they need to work on. I think that the communication there needs to be streamlined in a way to where, decisions are going to have to be made too on their part too. So I guess this is kind of a question / comment. So where do you feel like the pecking order, I guess, should be? Like, I think there isn't a real big discrepancy between people saying people over 75 should get it first, but then it's very gray.
I think those pecking orders are decided based on some disaster plans that have been sitting around for a long time on how to distribute these things. And then there's some debate. And it's really been up to the local governors as to how much or how little and who gets what when. Mm-hmm. And there's always going to be an argument about who should get what. Okay. Let's just look. The medication, the name of it is eluding me at the moment. The medication that they use with people who overdose on opioids.
Narcan.
Okay. Narcan. Okay. We spend all this money on Narcan. All the squads have Narcan.
Right.
So they've distributed it so that they can give doses to these people who are overdosing on the opioids. If I'm an 80-year-old who can barely afford his prescription drugs, am I going to favor Narcan for addicts that are overdosing?
Right.
Or would I prefer to see that money distributed in a different way? So again, sometimes when we start to talk about who should get what where and where the pecking order should be, it depends on the perspective that you're making the argument from.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Because clearly, I think that perspective lends itself to how you prioritize those things, if that makes any sense.
Do you think there needs to be a clear pecking order made, public, so people are aware? I mean, is that a decision that needs to be made? I mean, for people to have some kind of idea. Okay, well, here I'm in Class C or Class D or whatever, and this is what I can expect to.
I think
have a vaccine.
They've already published that in Ohio. I mean, we had the 1As,
okay,
and now the 1Bs, and I'm not sure what the number is on the next one, because it may be 2A and 2B. Okay. I don't know, but because I didn't study the whole thing, but I know they pretty much laid out the pecking order.
Okay,
and they want to get it distributed in a good way. Different states are going to have different rules with respect to that distribution. They want to get these medications into like your local drugstores to be distributed, because they've been the infrastructure to distribute the flu vaccine. So right. Not only could you go to your primary care physician and get it, although those physicians' offices have not been a part of the distribution, I think, typically because they don't want somebody that could be at risk going into an office where they could be exposed by somebody in the waiting room. So again, that's not been the way that they've done this. Local health departments are distributing. I think that they're setting up for these pharmacies to eventually be able to deliver these products, at least here in Ohio. And I would say that it makes sense because they've also been the distributor of the flu vaccine for many, many years, and they have the mechanisms to do that. It's a little bit different with social distancing. Mm-hmm. How many people can we have in the store? Usually those are walk-up appointments. You don't have to have an appointment to go in and get your flu shot. I'm not sure with the distribution issues that they may not require them then to have appointments to be done. Mm-hmm. But if your local health department is coordinating with those pharmacies, let's say, and they've got somebody that can do the logistics, okay, hey, I've got all of these people in this neighborhood here. This is the private pharmacy in that area. We could have them all go in. We're going to set appointments this way. Mm-hmm. And they set the appointments for the pharmacists up that way and keep people from congregating too largely in that area, because I think that's the other thing. You don't want a large crowd to turn out. Mm-hmm. When they talk, think about the pictures and the images that we've seen out of Florida, where you've got some of the most at-risk people over 65, mm-hmm. standing in long lines, not socially distanced, not necessarily wearing their masks the way that they're supposed to because they're outdoors. Mm-hmm. Okay, they're standing in these long lines and waiting for the shot that they never get because they get tired of waiting and they leave.
Right.
So again, I don't know how you.
Yeah. I guess one thing that I thought about when you were talking, and I read an article, it was in Forbes. I want to say it was like a couple of weeks ago. It was definitely within a couple of weeks. And there was a big discrepancy between, because obviously people in the healthcare system had a chance to get the vaccine. there were a lot of people who were not getting the vaccine, which I thought was interesting. And it was like a pretty high percentage. Now that may have changed since then, but it was like 40 some odd people of the whatever, that study specifically looked at weren't getting it or didn't feel comfortable yet getting it. And a lot of those people were young nurses, females, who, and then there was an anecdote, or not even so much an anecdote. I think there was a scare from some kind of fighting that it could lead to fertility issues. And I think that scared a lot of people. So now they're trying to remedy that. And I don't know. I don't know where I'm going with that, but any thoughts on that?
I heard one number that said only 63% of healthcare workers were getting the vaccine.
Right.
That doesn't really help to imbibe a lot of trust.
Right.
For people that they're asking to do this. And I think it's important to be informed. The media has loosely reported and suggested to us that that they allowed certain steps at the FDA approval level not to be implemented. And yet when you go to that site and you look at what they're telling us, the only requirement that got waived, of all of the steps, was the requirement of shelf life. Because technically for the FDA to approve a drug, it has to have a certain shelf life or they won't let it come to market.
They don't have to deal with that issue with this.
They did not deal with that issue with this because it doesn't really last long once it's not frozen.
Right. And they can't get them out fast enough.
So they waived, that was the only requirement that got waived. So all of the other things in terms of safety, in terms of human subjects testing. You might find this interesting. I was reading on my local private practice listserv for psychologists in private practice that they finally broke the blind of the study that was done. And they told the folks whether they got the placebo or they got the shot. And one of the psychologists that was on the listserv said, I really thought I got the placebo. Apparently, I was in the vaccination group, and I did well, and I'm doing fine. And he was like this testament to getting the vaccine. So it was kind of an interesting thing because how many people didn't even know whether or not, they were in a double-blind study.
Right.
And they didn't know.
Right. That is interesting.
Wait, they still ran double-blind studies. Oh, wait, that's like the standard for medications to be approved.
Mm-hmm. Right. That's interesting. I didn't know that. I didn't know that came out. So maybe it is just a communication problem. And I think, we talked about that in previous podcasts, to where so much information. You're just inundated with so many things. And if you see that one thing where it causes you some kind of concern, it seems to have like a priming effect. It kind of just stays there and it stays with you. And then hence why you see people that, didn't get vaccinated in the healthcare system right away when they could.
Well, I think sometimes, and we all know the urban legends that have been attached to this thing. We're all going to be microchipped when we go for this vaccine. These utter nonsense kinds of things.
Right.
There are other people that are talking now about, they get concerned about the problem with getting pregnant. They get concerned about, some people have talked about it altering your DNA. And the last time I checked,
and wasn't there some kind of
to that?
Wasn't there a group of people who thought like it led to autism, or was that the flu vaccine? This was an earlier vaccine.
That was the normal vaccinations that we were giving our kids.
Right. So chicken pox.
That was before chickenpox vaccine.
Okay.
Mumps, measles, rubella.
Okay.
Which we had obliterated in this country. We didn't have any cases of that because everybody had to take that vaccination before they ever got to school. Well, then homeschooling came about, so people were not getting their kids vaccinated. And we've had this resurgence of all of those illnesses. And I think it was it measles or mumps? one of the M's has come back. That had been it had been eradicated here.
Right.
Because everybody was vaccinated against it. And part of it was the backlash that people were saying that it somehow caused autism. There's a lot of things that cause autism, none of which we understand completely. Mm-hmm. We do believe that there's some relationship to toxins, because we see that, for example, the people that had their children or conceived their children and they were living close to some kind of a nuclear waste dump seem to have a higher incident rate of autism. So we know that there's some environmental factors that may contribute it. Do we know what the ones are? No. Do we have a full understanding and appreciation for it? No. Mm-hmm. Are there people that don't live near toxic waste dumps that have autistic children? Yes.
Yeah.
So I don't think we have a full explanation for that piece yet, but I think there was a huge backlash about vaccinations about that, that there is no scientific evidence to support that. It's one of those urban legends that somehow caught fire. Mm-hmm. And again, how does it happen? How do the people share that information? If we knew the secret of how that kind of information gets shared, and could follow it, I think that would really be a way of disseminating information in a much more efficient kind of way, because it was almost like a contagion. Every soccer mom you met was talking about it. Well, where did they get it from, though? Who did they hear, and how did it go from this person to this person to this person and spread as fast as it did? No one really completely understands it. But it's been something that's been around for a long, long time.
Yeah. I mean, it's scary. I mean, with today's world, it's a lot easier to do it with social media, to share and spread misinformation. And I think you've seen a lot of those, anti-vaccine groups come up. I mean, again, I've said this before, I'll say it again. I'm one that follows all things, like on both sides. So like the far left, the far right, I want to see what they're saying, and then hopefully I can make sense of it and talk about it. And there are things that are going around. I mean, conspiracy theories are a real thing. And, I think it's scary because on one hand, I don't like everything being labeled as a conspiracy theory when you're questioning something, right? So some people will just put you all the way, oh, you're a conspiracy theorist if you question something, right? But I think there is a slippery slope, and then you get these people who almost seek out an opportunity to believe something different and to spread that something different to others, just as a way to kind of social capital, if you will, so their voice can be louder than somebody else's voice. And it's a great way to do that. Is it healthy for society? No.
No. I don't think that, I personally don't think that asking the question is a bad thing, because I think we do have to question things, and we do have to question, is this something that is valuable? Is this something that is, what's the source of this? I mean, and sometimes we have to be a little bit cynical about it. Mm-hmm. Who said this? Sometimes it's a matter of who did the research and how the research was funded.
Right.
Because sometimes the funding, 4 out of 5 dentists say that chewing dentine gum is a good thing. Well, okay, we know who funded that study. Right. And so you begin to hear people will use statistics and information like that, but you go, well, how did they do this? And was it, and how did they arrive at this? There's always questions about people's methodology and the kinds of ways that they studied things. And, and sometimes there's a vested interest in having a finding come out a certain way, or not come out.
Right. And I think that's scary too. And it happens a lot. But I guess bringing it back to like current events and COVID, one of the things we're talking about, that Biden will face here coming up on Wednesday. I guess the one big question that has always, since this whole thing started, and I think early on, a lot of people were interested in it, but now it's kind of got to the point where we're on to other things like let's get vaccinated, right? But my big question, and again, when I say this, sometimes people look at me like, oh, you're a conspiracy, whatever. Okay. Here's my question. How did this start? We don't know yet. We don't know. And like, that's a question for me. Like, are people still digging at that? Or have we just completely went on to, vaccinating? But like, to me, it feels like if we can get to the root of the problem, maybe we're better prepared for, deterring something like this happening again on a much larger scale. But we don't have that answer yet. And we don't know.
I think, though, that we have viruses that are out there that mutate and that they change. And we have scholars that study virology that have probably a much better handle than most of us have. Unfortunately, they're not going to probably make the mainstream media because they're probably a little dry and how they present the science. And so it may just be that we're not going to get that information. We know that COVID has mutated already. Mm-hmm. And viruses tend to adapt in order to be able to continue. And there's been some adapting process that goes on. And so I think much of the research right now is being focused upon these stronger strains of this illness that have come out of these mutations, and to wanting to make sure that the antivirus medications that we are asking people to take are going to be effective in dealing with that. Mm-hmm. And so I think that's part of it. Yes, can we track back and go back and try to find the source of this thing? I think they are looking at that, because the more that you can understand it, the better it is to be able to find some means to understand it and to make a better cure. But again, I think it's a complicated question, because we do have some of the best scientific minds that are already looking at these kind of things, and mm-hmm. It's tough.
Yeah, you're right, though. It's not a sexy topic. It's not a sexy headline necessarily either. It doesn't work well in our media environment. It's not going to get people interested and engaged. I would listen to it. I probably wouldn't know what the heck's going on, but I'd try to make sense of some things. I mean, I don't know. I guess from my standpoint is I don't want something like this to happen again. And, one of the things I think we might have hit on is, there hasn't been a lot of talk about like boosting your immune system and the importance of that, mental health, all these sort of things that are connected, but not really as talked about. And maybe Biden will address some of those. I think it'd be a good decision.
It would be terrific if they could, and I think we'd like to have that happen. You just don't know where it's going to move to. The present issue is to create enough herd immunity mm-hmm. to stop this thing, and to stop this thing from causing the kinds of deaths that it's caused up until this point. And that's what they're hoping for. Mm-hmm. But the number of lives that have already been lost, the other kinds of ways that it's impacted people, the healthcare system, the healthcare system prepares and does some things to prepare itself for natural disasters and other kinds of things. I don't know that they necessarily had a preparation plan for a 100-year pandemic. I don't know that. And again, some hospital administrators would probably take me to task on that. But what I do know is that, if I live in a state where there's a lot of earthquakes, my healthcare professionals are preparing for an earthquake. And what would happen with our ER was inundated with casualties. They do that in terms of a fire. They do that in terms of, there are preparations and readiness kinds of drills that go on to prepare for those kinds of things. And I certainly don't want to say that we were ill prepared. I simply think that no one would have anticipated the level of contagion, the level of deaths that could occur based on a virus like this in a society where we live, where we pride ourselves on strong medical technologies in order to get past things. Mm-hmm. And work around things, and so that they don't affect us in that way. So it's a really tough. It's a tough area, I think.
Yeah.
And it'll be interesting to see what the president-elect does.
I think one thing I read in the Post article, he did say that one of the things he'll do is require face masks on all international travel, and I think that'll be something we see. And I don't know for sure, but I think that could be something that's forever changed in our society. Like maybe on an airplane, we always wear a mask. If you go and look at a lot of cultures in Asia, China in particular, with it being so populated and so dense in places like Beijing and Shanghai, it's a common practice. To wear a mask in public because of how quickly viruses and even, the common flu and things like that can spread when you're literally on top of people. All the time.
Right.
Right. So it'll be interesting in that respect too. And maybe we won't have all those answers until we get everybody vaccinated. We learn more about the virus and the various strains and things like that, to just see how our society changes fundamentally. Because I think there will be some of those changes that are going to take place. And maybe what Biden's role is in enforcing some of those things. I think it'll be fascinating. Again, it's only maybe a 4-year window, but it could set a precedent for things to be changed further.
It's interesting to me because I don't know that some of the things that we see in places like China may not have been easier to occur based on their culture and the collectivist mentality mm-hmm. that they seem to have about things. Whereas I think here in the U.S., we pride ourselves on being individuals. And so some of our decisions don't necessarily take into account our neighbor.
It's very true.
As much as the collectivist kind of viewpoint does. And so I don't know what to expect if we have mask mandates. Yeah. I'm not sure how much civil disobedience we might have, because again, we are a collection of individuals.
Right. You're 100% right, and I'll give you an example based on something I saw today. So China has had, I don't know if you want to call it a second round, or let's just say another round of lockdowns, because there's been a strain that's been spreading. And so they had 120 confirmed cases, right? Which is nothing compared to what we're dealing with here in the US. They had in a pocket, in an area, I forget which area, doesn't really matter, 120 confirmed areas, 22 million people on lockdown immediately, right? So that is a microcosm of how much different our society is than theirs. We right. can't get people to lock down, right? And part of that is we never really fully went on a full lockdown. Things were, some things were open, some things weren't.
Semi lockdown.
Right.
When you think about it, though, and again, I always like to go back to something that I observed. Okay, school districts, they've always been local rule, and for the most part, the governor left the decisions of the schools to the school, except at the very, very beginning of this thing. Secondarily, I think that the things that the state has always regulated here in Ohio, at least, like sales of beer and wine, sales of alcoholic beverages, are the things that they've taken the most control over.
Mm-hmm.
in terms of shutting down the bars, and anything that they've regulated, they have regulations on. They regulate gyms.
Mm-hmm.
Actually, one of the most highly regulated businesses in Ohio, bingo.
That's interesting.
I didn't realize that before.
I didn't know
The most
that.
highly regulated industry in the state of Ohio is bingo. And for the
That's
longest
pretty,
time, it was the only form of legalized gambling that you could do here.
Right. And people love bingo.
Before we had the lottery,
right.
we had bingo. And then we had the lottery, and then we got casinos. So I don't know what that says about us, but
Right.
But again, so the regulation of alcohol and alcohol consumption and when these places can open and close, that's always been under the purview of the state government. So when people start telling me, well, why is the schools open and this is, if we're in the midst of this, what about these poor people that work in the bars that can't work for the 2 hours extra that they used to work until midnight where they made their best tips?
Mm-hmm.
And I said, I just say, listen, the state has always regulated that.
Right.
It's just regulating it differently right now.
Right, but I think it's interesting because maybe it's more magnified now. Maybe people didn't even really think about it until they had to, because then they're like sitting there thinking, well, this is kind of silly. Like I can go to Walmart, any time of day, but I can't go here. Or I can't go there. I can go get beer and wine. That's of course. Play the lottery, but I can't go here. I can't go there. And I think you're right. I mean, I think we learned a lot. I know I have, how much local government plays a role. And I think you mentioned in an earlier podcast, all government is local. Is that
all government is local? Yeah.
Right. And I think that is really magnified when something like this takes place.
Mm-hmm. I think that the one thing that I would expect from the president-elect, who has paid a lot of and said a lot of things that he said he was going to take place. I think what they need to see is some distribution and some leadership on the federal government's part that gets the information that they seemingly said we're not getting to the states to march this out
mm-hmm.
as best as they can. And again, that may be in the way of funding, that may be in the way of equipment, that may be in the way of getting the number of vaccines delivered to the state that they can. I don't know that any state has used up their supply of vaccine. I don't think I've heard that reported anywhere. And
Right.
Yet people are saying, well, they promised us this many, we only got this many. Have you distributed all of it? Okay.
Right.
Nobody's distributed all of it because the distribution has been problematic, at least if you can believe what they tell you every morning.
Right.
In the news, and sometimes it's hard because I think there can definitely be some bias toward, what's happening in their location as opposed to what's happening in other places.
Yes, I think for sure. I mean, even this entire, pandemic is so different depending on where you are and how it's impacted certain communities and neighborhoods, even if you want to even narrow it down in these bigger cities.
Well, when we were shutting down here in March in Ohio, there were people in Florida that were out on vacation and in restaurants and crowded bars,
right,
and doing all those kinds of things. And I'm like, wait,
this doesn't add up.
This doesn't mean different states were implementing at different levels and different levels of security and different levels of safety precautions that we weren't seeing here.
Right.
And yet, if you look at it in terms of lives saved versus lives lost, I think our governor was pretty was pretty far ahead of the curve,
Mm-hmm.
and allowed for the shutdown that he implemented was helpful in terms of the spread of this illness, because in the states that didn't have those kinds of lockdowns that surrounded us,
Mm-hmm.
the number of cases that they experienced was much higher.
Mm-hmm. He was very proactive. He, meaning Governor DeWine. I remember it very
Yes.
early on, super, super proactive. And I think in this kind of situation, I think it's a win-win, because as you mentioned earlier, a lot of times we're reactive to things like this. And in states where they were reactive opposed to proactive, you saw a lot more cases, especially in that second wave and third wave of the virus spreading. But it will be interesting to watch Wednesday. And of course, we'll come back and we'll talk about what Biden talked about and kind of break that down in our next podcast.
It'll be a lot of fun.
Yeah.
Looking forward to it. We have obviously different viewpoints, but a lot of respect for the way that we see things, and from our various generational kind of viewpoints. But it should be kind of fun. So.
And I think that's what makes this podcast different, is that, we're not two people sitting in a room with the same beliefs, same ideas about things. Well, I think that can work. I think our approach is a little bit different in that we want to have civil discourse that even when we disagree, we can talk. Yeah. And I think a lot of people can glean from that in our society that we live in today, to where a lot of people, may not believe that that's even possible, right? And a lot of people wouldn't be able to do that maybe because of their strong beliefs, whether it be politically or anything of the sort. So that's kind of our approach.
Yeah, and we want folks to be able to think and to be able to take some ideas, and even if we don't agree, that they can take something from this that may be of value to them, even if they're loading up with something to debate this same issue with somebody else.
Exactly.
They can take these pieces from that as well.
Exactly. I forget where I read this, and we'll leave it with this. You don't have to agree to listen. You don't have to agree with someone to listen to someone. And I think we may be losing a little piece of that with where we are politically in our world today. You can learn a lot from listening to people with different ideas. You don't have to, believe everything. You can listen. So, okay. This was fun.
It was a lot of fun.
See you next time.
Next time.